you, Rooney, and thank you, Christy, for making this all possible. It's a remarkable coincidence that it's St. Patrick's Day today, and we didn't plan it this way. But today is actually the 250th anniversary to the day of probably the most important, other than the surrender of Yorktown, probably the most important day in the American Revolution, which was when Washington drove the British out of Boston. That happened today, 250 years ago. And you may know David McCulloch wrote a great book, 1776, which recounts about how Henry Knox, General Knox, brought these cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga, put them up on Dorchester Heights, and that's what eventually drove the British out of Boston. So I think this is so appropriate that we could, Scott, you could be here today. And by the way, we're so lucky to have Scott, because you can imagine on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, how much he is in demand. There was one organization that lined him up 3 years in advance. So we're very lucky to have you here, Scott. Thank you. Scott is president of the Museum of the American Revolution, which, by the way, is a relatively new museum. It'll be 10 years old next year. And so it's in Philadelphia. If you haven't been there, it's a must-go place to see. And they do such a creative job in educating young people and people of all ages, but he does a really terrific job. He's been president since it opened on 2017. He's been president since 2018. And for 10 years before that, he was head of the programs and the programs and exhibits, yeah, and the collections, yeah. So in any case, we're privileged to have him here, and I also want to mention that I've taken him duck hunting, and he's a very good shot. And once he killed a teal, and he organized it so the teal would actually land in the lap of the guide who was standing behind him. So the guy caught the teal like a football, and so that was a good shot. So, anyways, thank you, Scott, for coming and talking. Welcome.
That shot is merely proof that even the blind duck catches a squirrel everywhere, or even the blind squirrel gets a nut every once in a while, I guess is the way they say it. So anyway, thank you, Rooney. Thank you, Todd, for that great introduction. It is a real honor for me to be here at the Filson Society as a colonial American historian. The collection here sort of is in the pantheon of archives that are really absolutely world class. And as a native Pittsburgher, I feel a real spiritual connection to Louisville as well. You know, we're connected by this highway that they call a river. And I've not been to Louisville nearly enough in my life, but every time I've come here, it has felt like home to me. So thank you for this very warm introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Museum of the American Revolution. This is our front door at 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia, which is just 2 blocks from Independence Hall, right in the historic core of Philadelphia. And just give you a little introduction to the history of the organization and kind of our approach to trying in the 21st century to introduce rising generations of Americans to the complicated story of our nation and the enduring legacy of the American Revolution through our approach to exhibitions. And I'm going to talk about actually an object that is at the core of our experience in the museum. And then, believe it or not, we're going to land in Louisville at the end of that journey. I will not overpromise and underdeliver, I promise you. So if you step out of my office onto the terrace of the museum, you're looking back toward Independence Hall, and directly across the street is the first bank of the United States, founded by Alexander Hamilton. This building was completed in 1797. It's the first federal building other than forts under the United States Constitution, and was completed in 1797. So, pretty nice view. It's in the process of a multi-million-dollar restoration right now. It'll actually reopen and be rededicated in time for July 4th of this year with exhibits, and you'll be able to visit and go through it as well. But if you had stood roughly in that same spot in 1906, this is the view down 3rd Street. And can you make out the columns there sort of peeking out? So this neighborhood in Philadelphia was both really the center of the founding of America's financial system. This is where the Bank of North America, the first bank of the United States, Stephen Girard's bank, before the Erie Canal directed a lot of money to New York. Boo, you can still walk around this neighborhood and there's all these incredible, Greek temples that are all old banks, and not all of them have been torn down. So we still, like Louisville, have a lot of that great early architecture that reflects the history of our community. It is also, I don't know if you can make out some of the signs on those buildings. This was also a really significant center of publishing in the 19th, early 20th century. So the Saturday Evening Post, lots of national as well as regional and local newspapers and publications, all founded basically within about a 2-block radius of our front door now at 2nd and Chestnut. And actually in the building just toward you, next to the bank, was the location of a Philadelphia paper called the Evening Bulletin. That actually was published through till the 1970s. In August of 1906, this was one of the headlines that was run in the paper. Sacred relics to aid charity. General R.E. Lee, you've heard of him, his daughter, will sell 2 tents used by Washington to aid Confederate home, wants to raise $10,000. Now, that's where we're going to start on this journey. We're going to come back to this, but we're going to go on a little bit of a journey back in time, starting in 1775. So here is John Trumbull's famous painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775. That is the same day that the Continental Congress made a couple of really significant, that week, a lot of really significant decisions. One is when they came together in Philadelphia, it was toward the end of May in 1775. They had gone off after the First Continental Congress, which met right across the street from where the museum is now in Carpenter's Hall. They had sent a petition off to London to protest to the king that Parliament was not treating us as good English subjects who had rights, and recognizing that maybe things would go bad, they also recommended that each one of the colonies start to raise voluntary militias to start to raise men who might defend American liberty if it came to blows. So those men come back to Philadelphia late May of 1775 to the news that Lexington and Concord had happened on April 19th of 1775. Now they had to make a decision. First of all, was everybody knows what those people in Massachusetts are like. They've started a fight, and it's like a bar fight, right? Are we going to back our buddy, or are we going to let them take what they deserve? And so Congress decides, nope, we're in it to win it here. So they adopt that army in New England as the Continental Army. They vote to raise 10 companies of expert riflemen in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, and Virginia who are going to go north to join that army, and they have to appoint a commander-in-chief. Now, John Adams knew that despite the fact that John Adams never saw a job that he wasn't more qualified than anybody else to hold, and John Hancock felt the same way, actually. They needed a Southerner, right? They needed to bring these colonies together. And George Washington conveniently had showed up at the Second Continental Congress dressed this way. So he's wearing a uniform, and this is actually just a little footnote here, but a lot of historians traditionally have said George Washington showed up wearing his French and Indian War uniform. In fact, he had designed and had made a brand new uniform between the First and the Second Continental Congress. And this is the uniform that he designed. It was blue and buff, which were the traditional colors of the English Whig Party. So this was the party during the glorious Revolution of 1688, which had got rid of the Stuart absolutists. They had brought in the glorious revolution. They established Parliament's rights, the balanced constitution. This was the roots of the English liberties that Americans, like Benjamin Franklin, like George Washington, all those members of Congress, much of the population of British colonial America felt were their rights. And so that was not just a really handsome uniform. It actually had political meaning as well. And so this is Washington's uniform. He shows up at Congress. He's the only guy wearing a uniform, and signaling that he was ready to take up arms in defense of American liberty. And so Congress then on that day hands him this commission written on parchment as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army of the United Provinces of America. Washington now has to head up to Boston to take command of the army. And so he is escorted out of Philadelphia by the 1st City Troop. This is a military unit that actually still survives to the present day, founded in 1774 in Philadelphia. It's an active military unit of the Pennsylvania National Guard. They escort him all the way to New York City. Now, along the way, of course, the word had gone in advance of Washington's appointment. And so he's getting greeted along the way when he crosses the Delaware River, into Trenton, et cetera, et cetera. But the first big town, really city that he's going to come to is New York City. And so he's sort of given the keys to the city, as you would expect, and an address from the New York Provincial Congress. Now, this is really important. I'm going to read you a little bit of this, but you can read it too, because I'm going to put the words up there. We rejoice in the appointment of a gentleman from whose abilities and virtues we are taught to expect both security and peace. We have the most, I love the way they wrote in the 18th century. We have the most flattering hopes of success in the glorious struggle for American liberty and the fullest assurances. I feel like we should all read it together like we're in church, that whenever this important contest shall be decided by that fondest wish of each American soul and accommodation with our mother country, here's the important part, that you will cheerfully resign the important deposit committed into your hands and resume the character of our worthiest citizen. What are they worried about? Unlike most of us, not present company accepted, Americans today, do we study history like they studied history? They were so deeply steeped in classical history, and particularly ancient Rome and Greece and the foundations of democracy. They were thinking about these guys, right? Because in ancient Rome, during the Republic, there was a tradition of, during an emergency crisis, a dictator, now that word meant something different than it does to us today, was given essentially unlimited executive power for a limited period of time. And they did not have to, abide by the oversight of the Senate, but then were to give that power back. But just for example, there's two guys, and you've heard about the guy on the right, Julius Caesar, I assume, did not give that power back. And so that's what they're worried about, is we have just given this tremendous power to someone. And our study of history tells us that revolutions and rebellions are very dangerous. And oftentimes people wearing crowns today, when they look back through their genealogy, there's usually a brute at the beginning of that story who seized power. So here, literally within weeks of getting that commission in 1775, here is just a little bit of Washington's address back to the New York Provincial Congress. And this is such an important line that all Americans should know. When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. And we shall most sincerely rejoice with you in that happy hour, when the establishment of American liberty on a most firm and solid foundation shall enable us to return to our private stations in the bosom of a free, peaceful, and happy country. So he starts with a promise to the American people, that he is not in this to become the new King George. So he arrives in Boston on just before the 4th of July in 1775. This is a map of Boston. They filled the Back Bay, if any of you know Boston, so it doesn't look like this anymore, but it's a great reminder that it was this little isthmus surrounded. Some of you can probably make out the little parallelograms and the lines around it. Those are the camps and forts of the American forces that have bottled up the British Army in Boston. And in the center to the left, using the public buildings of Harvard, what's now Harvard University, Harvard College then was the center that was headquarters for General Washington. So he arrives here in July of 1775. Now, does this sound familiar? You go to war and you say, well, this couldn't possibly last very long. And so within a couple months, it was clear this is going to last a little bit longer than we expected. Now, Washington had headed to Philadelphia from Mount Vernon in a uniform, but he had not packed any camping equipment, right? He did not actually know he was going to war at the time. So in October of 1775, he sends this man, Colonel Joseph Reed, a Philadelphian, who was his aide-de-camp, one of his aide-de-camps, to carry dispatches back to Boston, or sorry, from Boston to Philadelphia to sort of report on the state of affairs and to begin making preparations, because this is the season when armies go into winter quarters. Now, the reason they go into winter quarters during the bad weather is that these armies can only move when they have gasoline for their vehicles. Now, today, gasoline comes out of the ground, right? In that period, it grew and it was called grass and hay, right? And so there is not a lot of gas in the wintertime in addition to the terrible roads. And so armies typically would go into winter quarters and then come out and begin campaigning. Usually by early June would be the beginning of a summer campaign season. So Washington knows, okay, we've got to figure out, how are we going to get the British out of Boston? Because they showed no signs of going anywhere. And we know we're going to be fighting them, if not here, somewhere. So one of Reed's jobs is also to put together all the equipment that he'll need to take the field, essentially a mobile field headquarters. Washington writes to him, this is written from Cambridge in March of 1776, and he is asking, what's happening in Philadelphia, but also asks about his equipage and says, I cannot take the field without equipage, and after I have once got into a tent, I shall not soon quit it. Now, he made a promise at this point. I don't think he realized what he was promising, because just to give away the ending, he was in the field for 8 years, the longest military conflict until the Vietnam War. And he was only back at Mount Vernon for a few days in 1781 after the surrender at Yorktown. So he stayed in the tented field with his army. And that's going to be a theme that I'm going to beat you over the head with for a few minutes here. So one of the things we know, Washington agreed to serve for no pay, because he was a gentleman, but that Congress would take care of his expenses. Now, a few congressmen did grumble that he was not very parsimonious with his expenses. But fortunately, a lot of the receipts have survived. So it allows us to really reconstruct a lot of the material world that he lived in during the war. And one of the things we know, he procured a pair of what were known as marquees. Here's some 18th century engravings that actually look exactly like what we know he was using. They were made by a man named Plunkett Fleeson, who was an upholsterer just a block from the front door of the museum at 4th and Chestnut. He had a great sign. The signs in the period that would hang outside would tell you kind of like what happened inside that particular shop. And his was the sign of the easy chair. But being a great entrepreneur, he shifted to war industry. So he went from upholstered chairs to making tents and flags and knapsacks and drums and other military equipment. So he makes a pair of marquees. The top one is known as a dining marquee. So it was basically a big canvas building that you would, about 22 feet long or so, about 14 feet wide, 10 feet high. And that's basically a big meeting room where he and his aides, and whenever they're doing meetings, can take place in that tent. The tent at the bottom really closely conforms to his sleeping and office tent, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But that's his personal living space. It's about a 8 by 10 foot room in the center. It's actually divided into rooms. On the right side was his bed chamber. On the left side, his enslaved valet, a man named William Lee, who stayed with him through the entire war, 8 years. He was the only person freed by George Washington in his will when he died in 1799. So these two men were incredibly close. And I wish we had William Lee's memoir of the Revolutionary War, because that was the canvas room where it happened. Now, 1776, those marquees are delivered when the army is gathering around New York, because they realize the British, as Todd said earlier, had evacuated Boston, but the British then gathers outside of New York in the harbor with the intention of capturing New York. Now, Washington was not sure, and he was right, that he could defend New York with the forces that he had available to him. It was a deep water port. The British Navy had over 400 ships. There were any Hamilton the musical fans here? 32,000 troops in New York Harbor. There were more than 32,000 troops and sailors, etc. And that Navy could deliver those men like wherever they wanted to be. So it was really an impossible task, but Washington did his best to try to defend New York. And so that campaign between late August and the beginning of December 1776, as Todd mentioned, David McCullough's great book, 1776, which chronicles that very dark year for American independence. Ironically, both the year we declare independence, but also the year when it seemed like that candle was going to be snuffed immediately. So this is a painting by the great Brandywine School artist Howard Pyle called The Retreat Through the Jerseys. And this is showing Washington's army as it's being pushed after fighting 11 battles and skirmishes around New York in the late fall, early winter of 1776, as they are retreating toward Pennsylvania. So you all know the crossing of the Delaware, the Emanuel Leutze painting, the very triumphant painting. There was an earlier crossing of the Delaware. There was the first week of December 1776, as Washington's army is retreating into Pennsylvania, crossing the Delaware from east to west. And the men who were part of that vastly diminished army, I mean, there's like 3,000 men rather than 30,000 men at the beginning of the campaign. They thought, this is it. Congress is packing up, fleeing Philadelphia. Everybody was sure that General Howe's army was going to cross that Delaware, march into Philadelphia, and hang all those 56 men who had signed the Declaration of Independence, not to mention anyone found under arms fighting in a rebellion against the king. Congress does an extraordinary thing at the end of December 1776. They grant free, ample, and complete powers to George Washington. This is exactly what the ancient Roman Senate did when it created a dictator. He is literally given the right to appoint his own officers. Up to that point, it wasn't George Washington's signature on an officer's commission. It was John Hancock, the president of Congress, or the secretary, Charles Thompson. He was able to determine if, Todd Sedgwick, if you are a traitor to the United States of America, summary justice there, right? Outside of our elected Congress. He is able to seize private property to impress wagons, food, whatever he needed, right? It is dictatorial powers, and they give it to him for a 6-month period. Now, you know things are pretty dark when this happens. Washington, once again, this is the letter that he writes back to Congress. Instead of thinking myself freed from all civil obligations by this mark of their confidence, I shall constantly bear in mind that as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties, so it ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established. Washington is teaching his army, the American people, reassuring Congress, like what the American Revolution is about, right? We tend to think of him as a battlefield leader, but he is a political leader as well. This is not automatic that we know how to create a republic, certainly not a republic that is going to be enduring. And so that's the first year of this 8-year conflict. Washington's already showing this story. Now, one of the other things that's really important that I want to persuade you that tent that he bought is as important to us as Americans as a political artifact as it is as a military artifact. So you start to see people, this is the spring, May of 1777, people commenting on, unlike most European officers who kind of disappear for long periods of time, particularly when the weather's bad, right? They go home. They go and stay in comfortable quarters. Washington is staying in the tented field. And so you read many comments like this. His Excellency, our good old general, has also spread his tent and lives amongst us. Here later at the end of that year, this is William B.T. Trago's magnificent painting of the March to Valley Forge from the collection of the Museum of the American Revolution, showing the army marching into Valley Forge on December 19th of 1777. But there you see below, in the daily orders that he had issued 2 days earlier as they're moving toward Valley Forge, he himself will share in the hardships and partake of every inconvenience. He's making that promise to his men. Now, people overseas are paying attention, right? They are also keen students of history. You all know the story, I'm sure, that the American painter Benjamin West, who is the court painter to King George III, King George III asks him in the middle of the Revolution, well, if the Americans gain their independence, what will Washington do? And he says, well, I think he'll go back to his farm in Virginia. And he says, if he does that, it will make him the greatest man of the ages, right? Everyone's wondering, is he going to do it? And so this is an engraving. And actually, I had a great chance to visit Locust Grove that I want to see a show of hands. How many of you have visited Locust Grove? Oh, this is a good crowd. How many of you visited Locust Grove in the last year? Still a lot. This is a very important place. I'm going to come back to this, but this engraving is hanging over the fireplace, by the way, so you can see an original copy of it. And the legend, which I've kind of cut off the bottom here, but is General Washington, and then the Latin translates roughly as that the state shall receive no harm, right? So in France, in England, etc., people are looking at, hey, what's this guy going to do? So this was a little hopeful, but still with a question of what's going to happen at the end of the war. So by now, you're very familiar with Charles Willson Peale's portrait of Washington. This is the first portrait of Washington during the Revolutionary War. The second portrait, life portrait of Washington. Peale actually went to Mount Vernon in 1772. Some of you may know the red-faced blue uniform of his French and Indian War service. When Washington comes to Philadelphia in May of 1776 to bring dispatches to meet with Congress because the British had evacuated on St. Patrick's Day, yay. And so actually he sat for Charles Willson Peale. John Hancock actually commissioned this portrait of Washington. Frankly, he was a little bit of a suck up, because he wanted to be, he thought, well, I'm a very rich guy and I'm going to have a portrait of General Washington and I will be able to be associated with this great general by doing this. But actually, over where you see his sword on the right side, you see Dorchester Heights and some soldiers manning a cannon. Off in the distance is Boston, and even beyond that, there's smoke rising from Bunker Hill. So it's very symbolic. It's compressing time, but it's basically commemorating that first siege of Boston and Washington as the victor of the siege of Boston. But over his shoulder is this blue moire silk ribbon that you see, and that's the only piece of the uniform that he had not showed up in Congress wearing. When Washington arrives in Boston with his commission, one of the things he very quickly realizes is that nobody knows who he is. And not only that, they don't know he's in charge. And to a Virginian in particular, but really to a military commander, that's pretty important. The New Englanders, there's such a different military culture, really, religious, military, social culture that exists in New England. It's important to remember that we were not destined to become a nation. In 1774, when this is all going toward the outbreak of war, Connecticut and Pennsylvania are in a shooting war with one another over what's now the Wyoming Valley, northeastern Pennsylvania. Virginia and Pennsylvania in a shooting war over whether Pittsburgh, my hometown, is part of Virginia or Pennsylvania. The glue that had held these colonies together for 2 centuries, in some cases, had been this sort of distant king or queen who did not mess with you very much in daily life, right? And when that dissolves, then one of the challenges Washington has is how do you get these people to see one another as Americans? One of the things he confronts is that these New Englanders are so democratic that they elect their officers. And so if you are a captain and your commission, so your status, your pay, etc., depends on the goodwill of your men, are you going to really be that hard on them? The Southerners who come up see, oh my, I actually saw a captain shaving like one of his privates. That did not sound right. Shaving one of the soldiers who served under him. You would never see that in the British Army. You would never see that, in the middle and southern colonies where their sense of sort of social hierarchy was much more established and frankly more compatible with creating a kind of professional military that was going to be necessary if you were going to try to stand up to a professional army like the British Army. So one of the first things Washington does, he tells all the New England officers, you have to wear a sword and you cannot shave your soldiers. And he institutes a system of ribbons. So he wears a blue moire silk ribbon. It's actually in those receipts. So we know what day he bought it and how much he paid for it. He says, a ribbon to distinguish myself by. If you were an aide de camp, you wore a pink ribbon, very resplendent. It was a different age. General officers wore green ribbons. So there was a system of these ribbons, and they were to wear them so that the soldiers, the officers, would understand who was actually in charge. Now that ribbon, it's not just interesting because I like ribbons. It actually is about what being a Republican, small r Republican general was about. Charles Wilson Peel and his family ultimately they basically have a factory producing portraits of George Washington. Everybody wants a picture of this guy. In Europe, every court wanted a picture. Who is this guy that's taking on the British Army? This is a portrait of Washington commemorating the victory at Princeton in January of 1777. So if you see Nassau Hall off in the background, some of the captured British and Hessian flags underneath his feet, leaning jauntily on the cannon and wearing that blue ribbon over his shoulder. But by the middle years of the war, this created a little bit of a challenge because there was another guy named George who also wore a blue ribbon over his shoulder. His name was King George III. Of course, the practice of wearing ribbons is very common in Europe for aristocracy, right? Marshals of European armies, monarchs, etc. And so if you see later portraits by Charles Wilson Peel, they look like this. There's a missing, disappearing ribbon. This is a portrait commissioned by the Assembly of Massachusetts right at the end of the Revolutionary War. Actually, you can still see it hanging in Annapolis in the fantastic State House there of Washington in front of his tent with French and American soldiers flanking surrendering British soldiers at Yorktown in 1781. So a French officer left us like a perfect quote that we historians love. This is 1779, so right in the middle years of the war, where he talks about formally on solemn occasions, particularly on days of battle, Washington wore a large blue ribbon, but he has given up that unrepublican distinction. So there was a rumor that had sort of started to circulate that Washington had secretly been made a marshal in the French army. Now, why is that important? If you're a soldier serving under Washington and you get captured by the British Army, do you have diplomatic immunity, right? So essentially, if he's secretly made a marshal, it's like being given diplomatic immunity. He's been made a citizen of France. He has the protection of the King of France. And so he lays that aside. And so that ribbon has actually survived because he gave it to Charles Willson Peale, who had painted him so many times. And it actually passed down as part of the Peale Museum, eventually purchased by P.T. Barnum. There's an amazing another hour lecture about the whole history of this Peale Museum, including Lewis and Clark objects that were here in Louisville at the end of the expedition and ended up in the Peabody Museum at Harvard. So there's our guy, Washington, developing a fine sartorial sense of what a Republican general is like. He is not covered in bling, right? This is not a guy who puts gold all around him. He is dressing as plainly as possible. He is joined by a guy who does not mind wearing a ribbon. This is General Rochambeau, Marshal of the French Army, who, if there was ever an incredible bromance that should go onto the big screen, it's between Rochambeau and Washington, who in 1781 bring their armies down to encircle Yorktown, Virginia, and trap General Cornwallis's British army against the sea. Here's an engraved map published in 1782 that's a very careful American engineer's survey of the battlefield at Yorktown. But the detail I love is there he's got Washington and Rochambeau's headquarters next to each other with their tents. And again, I want you to remember through all of these years, these guys are sleeping out there with their armies. Those soldiers are seeing them through thick and thin. This is a painting that hangs at the Museum of the American Revolution. If any of you have visited Versailles in the past, the great Hall of Battles, there's the Hall of Mirrors as one wing, the Hall of Battles is the other. These are great canvases from the 1830s that are commemorating French military victories, some of which actually took place, going all the way back to ancient times. But the one American subject is the scene of Yorktown. So it's Washington, Rochambeau, who's gesturing. You can see Lafayette in the door of the marquee during the siege of Yorktown. Some of the Oneida Indian Nation represented up above, who were present as allies of the Continental Congress. One of the amazing things about Yorktown and Washington in these later years of the war is how many men half a century later were still talking about Washington in that tent. Here's just two examples. These are quotes from Virginia men who were in the militia, who were at Yorktown, and they're applying for their pensions in the 1830s. So these are very elderly men at this point. Francis Cole talking about had the gratification of seeing General Washington every day as his marquee was near his tent. And Carey Traylor, who actually was very proud to say that he had conversed with General Washington at his tent. Now imagine for a lowly private militia soldier to remember and imagine him telling his family that, I didn't just serve under Washington, I spoke with him. He spoke with me. It says something about the revolution as well, about breaking down the kind of inheritable hierarchy of the Ancien regime and about the Republican experiment that we launched with this incredible revolution. So the sort of end of that Revolutionary War story, to me, I'm going to differ with Todd and say even more important than St. Patrick's Day 1775 was a series of events that took place right there in the Hudson Highlands north of New York City. around a place called Stony Point, which some of you may have heard of if you're military historians, and Verplancks Point, and Newburgh, and West Point. So this is the area where the Hudson River narrows as you're going north of New York City, going upstream. And so that's the place where there was a very important crossing place called King's Ferry. That was the lowest place you could easily ferry troops back and forth between New England, New York, and the southern colonies. The British recognized this was a really important strategic point. The British theory had always been, perhaps they were right, the real troublemakers were the Yankees in New England. And if we could just cut New England off from the middle and southern colonies, surely all of those good people would want to come back and embrace the British Constitution. And so that is some of the most contested ground in the Revolutionary War. They're fighting constantly through the war, taking and retaking and fortifying and blowing up fortifications in that area. So after the after the siege of Yorktown in 1781, Washington, Cornwallis literally is like just surrendered, boom, they're done. Washington immediately marches his army back up to the Hudson Highlands. There are still 30,000 British troops in New York City. He is still burning with resentment that he lost that city, the embarrassment of having lost that city. To the very last minute, Washington dreams of a frontal assault to retake New York. Fortunately, all of his calmer generals said, I don't think we should do that. And so that's not ultimately how it ends. But the French army actually stays down in the Tidewater. And so if any of you are fans of Colonial Williamsburg, for instance, the Colonial Williamsburg restoration, since celebrating its 100th anniversary, is based on a map called the Frenchman's Map that was done in 1782, showing every single building that stood at that time in Williamsburg, almost down to like the smokehouses and outhouses and fences. That was done by a French engineer who, you know, the thing you do with soldiers is keep them busy when they're not fighting or they get in trouble. So they were engineers, you guys do a lot of maps down here. So that's how they spent that winter. And then in 1782, a lot of the fighting was shifting down to the Caribbean. Remember, all of those sugar-producing islands, they're incredibly rich economically for these European empires. And so a lot of the fighting is going to shift down to the Caribbean. So a French fleet is going to come and pick up that French army and take them to the Caribbean. I cannot tell you why they did not pick them up in Virginia, but they literally made Rochambeau's army march to Boston to get picked up and then sail to the Caribbean. And I turned the map every which way I can, and it does not make sense to me, but that's what happened. Fortunately, what that meant is that the French and British armies that had collaborated to capture Cornwallis had a little reunion in the late summer of 1782 at a place called Verplancks Point. Now, I do not expect you to know what you're looking at here, by the way. But this is a painting that the museum acquired the summer after we opened, actually in 2017. And it's actually an 8-foot-long panoramic watercolor landscape painting showing a Continental Army encampment. So there are hundreds of little tents off in the distance with regimental designations. There are officers' tents in the foreground. When I first saw this thing pop up on an online auction that was coming up, and I clicked on, you know, you have the little spyglass that you can click and it enlarges it, and I saw this. And if I had a defibrillator, it would have gone off. And here's why, because that is George Washington's tent. How did I know this? Well, I had spent 10 years at this point researching Washington's tent and had not found a single eyewitness in the field image of Washington in his tent, which everybody in the period is like, this guy is awesome because A, he tells us he's going to go home at the end of the war, and B, he is staying here in the field with us. You would have thought somebody would have drawn an image. Well, somebody did. And I immediately remembered people describing this encampment. So this is an observer who was here in the late summer of 1782, who's describing opposite the camp, meaning where the soldiers were off in the other direction, these eminences and tents of the general officers, and then predominant that of George Washington. Now, why does this matter? Well, another French officer who was there with Rochambeau's army, I think, crystallized this beautifully at this late period of time. And keep in mind, most of us have been taught Lexington and Concord in 1775, Yorktown in 1781, signed, sealed, delivered, that's the story, right? The war goes on for 2 more years. George III was not going to give up his North American possessions, because when you're a king, you get judged on 2 things. Did you produce a male heir, and did you lose or did you grow the territory that you had at your coronation? And so they had to drag George kicking and screaming out of this conflict. So Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Vergere says, this is from his diary during the encampment. He says, Washington was on the point of taking a house, meaning a place for his headquarters, when he decided to set an example to his soldiers by living in camp. Now, if you've driven from Newport to Yorktown, you cannot drive 8.5 minutes, it would seem, on a secondary road without George Washington slept here, right? You know, and he did sleep in many of those places. But in those headquarters, of course, Washington's tent is always set up in the yard. That was the private space. He would have soldiers set up at the door, and that's where he went to read and write those dispatches. Think of the highest moments, the lowest moments of the war. They happen under that canvas. And so this French officer, again, is talking about how adored he is, even by the foreigners, meaning the French soldiers and officers who see this extraordinary man. Now, this then is the George Washington of the end of the Revolutionary War. On the left, how many times have you seen that Peel portrait now? A couple times now. On the right, actually one of my favorite portraits of George Washington. This hangs at the museum. It is by the American artist Joseph Wright, who Washington sat for in November of 1783, so the very end of the Revolutionary War, as the war was winding down, the Continental Army was being dispersed. And you know, you all are used to looking probably at that juxtaposition, right? And that's only 4 years apart, and Abraham Lincoln did not sleep in a tent very much during the Revolutionary War. So when I look in the eyes of this portrait, which, by the way, Washington knew this portrait. It was painted for the Powell family of Philadelphia. And actually, you can visit the Powell house. It's just down the street from the museum on 3rd Street. They were very, very close to Washington, Samuel Powell, Elizabeth Powell. She is actually the woman, you probably know the anecdote at the Constitutional Convention, where Dr. Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, was reportedly asked by a woman, what kind of government do we have? A republic, if you can keep it. The woman is Elizabeth Powell, and this hung in her parlor. Bushrod Washington, who was Washington's nephew, who would later be a Supreme Court justice, you know, practiced law in Philadelphia in the time when Washington is president, told the family, and it passed down as oral tradition, that Washington, when he described this portrait, said that it was very like, but not flattering, which is every beach picture that I have ever taken in my entire life. So I feel like you are seeing George Washington at the end of the Revolutionary War. And when I look in those eyes, I think about what I think is the most important, fragile moments of the Revolutionary War. Because the hardest thing is to end a revolution, right? To bring a successful rebellion to an end. Armies refuse to disband, right? Generals become dictators and kings. And that's the moment in early 1783, the preliminary articles of peace have been signed. Both sides are bringing the violence down, but there's still fighting taking place. And by the way, we're going to talk about the West here in just a second, where it actually heats up. But officers who had been promised pensions, for instance, who hadn't been paid in years in many cases, are starting to go, you know, maybe we should just get out of the way and let the British march to Philadelphia, right? Maybe we move across the mountains into I hear the Ohio Valley is very nice, for instance, and found some settlements out there. And a group of these officers start to meet in Newburgh, New York, illegally, because of course this is not following the military chain of command. And they had built a large meeting hall, kind of like you're sitting here right now, called the Temple of Virtue. It was the place, for their Republican civic virtue. But they're meeting there and they're grumbling, and they're like, maybe we need to make Washington a king. And Washington gets word that this meeting is going to happen. So he shows up. And can you imagine, you all are in there conspiring, and I walk in and go to the podium, and they're like, oh, we're in trouble now. And so if you go to Boston, to the Massachusetts Historical Society, Washington's original Newburgh address in his hand, in that very distinctive looping hand of his, actually is in the collection there. In 2012, I got to stand there with an archivist and David McCullough, and we each got to hold a page of it together. Whew, I should have retired then. I mean, it was incredible, right? And so Washington gives this address, and then he pulls out a pair of spectacles and a letter. Now, none of those men had seen him wearing a pair of reading glasses. Probably the only person who knew that Washington was William Lee, his enslaved valet, who probably had handed those glasses to him in that private space. And he says, I've never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, I've been the constant companion and witness of your distresses. I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. And there are many accounts of men who were there. And these were men who had charged into the mouths of cannon, and they wept. And with that act, Washington saves the Republic in one of its most fragile moments. And they are able to disband that army, and Washington is able to sit for that portrait. And then on 2 days before Christmas in 1783, Washington is in Annapolis, Maryland, to meet with Congress. Now, why is Congress in Annapolis? Because of the crab cakes? No. Philadelphia was too dangerous for our elected officials, because there were disbanded soldiers with muskets and bayonets walking up Chestnut Street asking to speak with their congressman. It was actually a terrifying, dangerous place. Congress had moved up to Princeton. They realized, we got to get out of Jersey. They go to Annapolis, and that's why they're meeting in Annapolis. And so there, this painting, again by John Trumbull, is showing Washington returning that very same commission. You can see it today in the National Archives because he returned. That is his first, but not his last time handing power back to the people. Part of his address that night is, having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted. I here offer my commission and take my leave of all employments of public life. And you can't even make this up. He gets home to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve of 1783. Amazing. And it is for this reason, let's bring it down a little closer, right up the river here. He is called the American Cincinnatus because, again, gesturing back to ancient Rome, the ancient Roman general Cincinnatus had left his plow and gone to save the Republic, and then returned to his farm. And so those officers who serve under him form the Society of the Cincinnati. They name a town after Cincinnatus. And he is one of the reasons why we think of Washington as the indispensable man. But he comes out of retirement and again is made president of the United States for a second time, given extraordinary power, given the executive power that hasn't even been particularly well defined. It's something we struggle with today, right? As we read the Constitution, and we are now in this centuries-long existential conversation about balancing liberty and power and balanced government, right? And the Constitution is really awesome, but it does not answer all the questions that we want it to answer. And Washington, we cannot overemphasize his importance of defining you know, what the cabinet would be and how the president would act, and the precedent of 2 terms as president. And so Washington then, and I just want to point out this little fellow on the left, George Washington Parke Custis, is Washington's adopted son. It's his grandson. It is Martha Washington's grandson by her first husband. But when Washington dies in 1799, of course, he's eulogized by his dear friend Henry Lee as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. I hope it rings a little bit more, you have a little bit more depth of what he actually meant by that, what those words meant to the audience that was hearing that in 1799. There's GWPC, as we like to call him, George Washington Parke Custis. He builds a house called Arlington, overlooking the new federal city, named after George Washington, Washington, D.C. He does not accomplish a tremendous amount during his life. He is in the profession of being related to Mount Vernon and the Washington family. So at Arlington House, and that's a little cruel. I hope there are no Custis Lee descendants here in the family, but he becomes known as the person who has the relics of Mount Vernon on display at Arlington House. That's actually an engraving in the center by the historian Benson Lossing of Washington's tents packed up at the end of the Revolutionary War in their carrying cases with the poles as he saw them and sketched them at Arlington in the 1840s. Amazingly, those tents were not just packed up at the end of the Revolutionary War. Custis used to take them out, and this is again the sleeping in office tent. He would take them out and set them up on the grounds of Arlington and have parties under them. It is amazing there is even a thread of any of these things left, because all through the 18 teens to about the 1812 period, they have these amazing parties out on the lawn at Arlington House. And it's wonderful to read the newspaper coverage from Washington, D.C. The first few years, they would print the entire text, like multiple pages of this long oration by George Washington Parke Custis. He referred to the tent as the Praetorium of Liberty, and it was very bloviating in terms of the language that he would use. And then after a couple of years, they would sort of start to do an executive summary of his remarks. And then eventually it was like, and then Mr. Custis gave his usual remarks at the picnic. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was really kind of the adopted son of George Washington during the Revolutionary War, had come over as a 19-year-old, served through the Revolution, and is sort of one of the last of that generation still living in the 1820s of the generals of the Revolution. He comes back for a triumphal tour through all of the new United States, including here in Kentucky and Louisville. And in Baltimore, they did this amazing, like a production worthy of Donna Lawrence Productions of Louisville here. They took the tent and they set it up on the grounds in the parade ground of Fort McHenry, right? You all know Fort McHenry, Star Spangled Banner, we sing about it all the time. And it had been so, it was 10 years earlier roughly when this took place. So it was like, probably there was still smoke from the British bombardment floating around. They actually brought the original Star Spangled Banner out and had it flying from the flagpole. And then in the center, you saw the militia drawn up, the state militia of Maryland. And up the Patapsco River comes a steamboat. Think of somebody who fought in the Revolution and is in a steamboat. He alights, the Marquis walks up into the fort, the state militia opens their ranks, and there is Washington's tent. Now, as if that wasn't awesome enough, under the tent are officers of the Society of Cincinnati, so surviving Revolutionary War officers who had served with him, and Charles Carroll, who would be the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died 1826 on July 4th. That night, now these men wept. I mean, he said, oh, I remember Lafayette was in tears. Thousands of people witness this moment. John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, in a way was a Revolutionary War veteran. As a boy, as a 9-year-old boy, he had climbed up on the roof of his house with Abigail Adams to listen to the distant gunfire of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he'd been under British fire in a ship when he and his father were sailing on John Adams' diplomatic mission to Holland during the Revolutionary War. So he'd heard shots fired in anger during the Revolution. John Quincy Adams, about to be elected president, gave a toast that night, the tears of glory, gratitude, and joy shed under the tent of Washington. Now there's George Washington Parke Custis, photographed by Matthew Brady on the eve of the Civil War. And we like to say, fortunately, he died shortly thereafter, because he had started in the 1840s cutting up the tents and giving pieces away as souvenirs. And they would not have survived had he been much longer living. His daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, married the dashing first in his class at West Point, Robert E. Lee, in 1833. I think I've got that right. Now, as you all know, in 1861, Robert E. Lee took a different job, which required him to leave home for a while. And so this is Arlington House during the occupation by federal troops. This woman, Selina Gray, on the right side, was Mary Lee's personal servant, who had the keys, was entrusted to the keys to the house after the Lee family left. And she's the one who worked with the federal troops, General Irvin McDowell, who's the heavier set guy, kind of right of center, to take all of those relics of Mount Vernon, including Washington's tents, into Washington, D.C., where they were placed on display at the Patent Office, which is now the National Portrait Gallery, later displayed during the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia. You see this stereoscopic card, actually set up outside the Smithsonian in 1805. What you're seeing in the foreground is that dining tent. In the background is the roof of that sleeping tent. On the left side, a Smithsonian curator cooking over an open fire with Washington's original mess chest. Conservators do not smile on this practice nowadays, I will tell you. But that actually brings you then to where we started, which was this newspaper. Mary Custis Lee, who is the last surviving child of Robert E. Lee, their daughter, who never married, was appointed a trustee of the Confederate Widows' Home in Richmond. And she was trying to raise money to care for the wives of men who had served under her father in the Army of Northern Virginia. There they are. On the right, Mary Custis Lee. On the left, an Episcopal priest named W. Herbert Burke, who was founding something called the Washington Memorial Chapel right in the middle of Valley Forge, what's now Valley Forge National Historical Park. And Burke wanted to build a museum about the American Revolution and George Washington. So he got a group of people together. They put $500 down on a $5,000 agreement, and they started to raise money to purchase this tent. He did what museum directors do. He took it out and he set it up in the snow, again, frowned upon by conservators now, and sold souvenir postcards. He put it on display. There's the roof of it on display in the Washington Memorial Chapel. They charged 10 cents. Later, raised to 15 cents. And then every month they would split the proceeds with the family. Today, then, the museum is on display in this fantastic theater at the museum. The film, again, by your local heroine, Donna Lawrence, my dear friend. I call her Aunt Donna now because I've known her so long. But you can see just a few screen caps. It's really telling the story much more succinctly than I can that you have just heard. It is an incredibly moving experience. That is my shadow as George Washington, by the way. Just one recent visitor comment: people regularly, like Lafayette, shedding tears in the presence of George Washington's tent. Just a few images to give you a sense of the experience in the museum here. It's very immersive, 16,000 square feet, very tactile. We try to dial down the technology and dial up the tactile, immersive elements, taking you on this journey of subjects becoming citizens. And so I just wanted to close at Todd's request with situating and reflecting on the local story here. As you get to the end of the exhibition, we have a theater that talks about the war in the West. Now, of course, there had been action going on throughout that war that we're much more familiar with in the East. George Rogers Clark, of course, founder of Louisville, and inhabitant of Locust Grove, and it was very moving for me to be in the room where he spent his final years today. This is just a map of the campaign, Clark's campaign, that actually resulted in the founding of Louisville in 1778. So your 250th is coming up. Now, we struggle a little bit, I think, to connect the sort of story I've been talking about, the Eastern story, the story of the Declaration of Independence, of creating a republic based on the well-being of all people, of inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with the lived experience of the people struggling for domination, control of the lands that we're on right now. This is an image that's dominated the way that story has been remembered for most of the last quarter millennium. Although in fairness, that violence went back and forth. And this is an image of the terrible massacre at Gnadenhutten in Ohio in 1782, when a group of Western Pennsylvania militiamen captured a community of 92 Christianized, non-combatant Native men, women, and children, and put all of them to death in March of 1782. It's a story that has been difficult sometimes to pull a broader perspective on those almost impossible to reconcile lived experiences. To me, one of the most impactful statements I've ever read is by a Seneca man, went in English by the name Old Smoke. And in 1782, in a treaty council negotiation with the British up at Fort Niagara, talking about this conflict, he says, if we had, meaning Native people, had the means of publishing to the world the many acts of treachery and cruelty committed by them on our women and children, it would appear that the title of savages would with much greater justice be applied to them than to us. William Irvine, a commander at Fort Pitt, just up the river, as you know, writing, this is the spring, April of 1783, and he's reporting to Washington about a recent attack of some Ohio Native people on backcountry settlers in Western Pennsylvania, who at this point in the war, as everyone knows, peace is coming. Both sides knew that the territory you control at an end of the war tends to be where the lines are drawn. So there is a press of white settlers who are pushing west out of places like Pittsburgh and here in Kentucky. And Native people, despite the British trying to restrain them because they're saying, no, we're negotiating peace, are saying, no, we're driving this. We're defending our sovereignty and independence. And this quote, again, depressing to read today, because he's saying that both of these sides, basically the backcountry settlers are never going to make peace. And the only solution here, it's really anticipating the era of removal. So at the museum, we can't tell all the stories. We can't tell the complete story of the American Revolution, just to conclude. But we try to tell a story of the American Revolution that broadens that story. We talk a lot about empathy, ultimately, is the most important thing we're doing. I would love it if visitors went away and knew the date that Cornwallis surrendered and the date of Lexington and Concord, and they knew the names of a bunch of generals. And as an American historian, that is really important. But the most important thing is to feel a kind of emotional connection with those people, to feel something about the difficult decisions that they had to make with imperfect information, with life and death decisions. What you're seeing is a gallery in the museum where we have taken historic people from the Oneida Indian Nation who we know fell across the spectrum of, we should side with the British, we should side with the Continental Congress, we should try to remain neutral as two armies are invading their country, right? And when we opened this museum in 2017, if you remember the war that was going on in Syria at the time, and we talked a lot with our students about, there's a place where you understand that there are people having this very same conversation right now, because they don't know ultimately who is the force that's going to prevail. And the decision that we make will affect, our lives, our families, our community. So we're trying to bring this era that can seem so remote to life for people and start them hopefully on a journey of exploring the roots of this nation. So one of the last things you encounter in the museum is this wall, and there are photographs on that wall. Those are photographs of people who were alive during the Revolutionary War and lived into the age of photography. Some of them were children, but some of them were soldiers. There's one American Indian veteran of the Battle of Oriskany. There is Isaac Granger, born in 1776. Appreciate the irony, at Monticello, to the author of the Declaration of Independence. And so we encourage all of our visitors, and particularly our young people, to sort of look in the eyes of those people, to reflect on their connection to this founding generation of the nation. And I'll leave you just with a couple of comments. Again, visitors who talk about the impact that this approach of telling a broad and inclusive story of the American Revolution, the impact that it has on them. That the most effective part of the museum is putting you in the place of society at the time, how impossible and fragile and uncertain and terrifying it must have seemed. I get chills reading that. It brings out, this is the one I love, it brings out the complexity and humanity of this tumultuous period without holding back on its dark side, but while preserving the radical optimism of the message. And that, I would suggest to you, as we as a nation are fighting right now, literally fighting over what do we mean, what's the story we want to tell about ourselves? What is patriotic history, right? Is patriotic history only hearing things that make me feel good? I would argue, and I think I got the evidence to back it up, that as a mature nation, a nation that's confident of itself, that actually the most patriotic act is to think of the American Revolution not as something that happened a long time ago and we judge it by what it achieved in 1783 or 1787. It is to judge it as an ongoing experiment. And so what we ask those students to do, and this is literally the last image that I've got for you, it's the last experience in the museum, is looking in mirrors, meet the future of the American Revolution. It is asking them, you have the torch now. We ask them, Declaration of Independence, what does it promise? Equality. Is everybody equal today? I'm not telling you, I'm asking you. And usually they'll say, well, no. And that's, well, who? Are they still here to do anything about it? No. I literally had a kid once, I said, well, then whose job is it now? And he looked at himself and he went, me? And so that's what we're trying to do. That is what the Filson is doing. I was so inspired by, I'm going to keep talking about Locust Grove, because Locust Grove is a place where literally the two families that came together there are both sides of the story that I told you there. They are the East and the West coming together. I was just like, I mean, historians just absolutely love it. It is such a rich opportunity we have. When I think back 50 years ago, when I was a 10-year-old, what the bicentennial did for me to like spark this interest and this curiosity about, 200 years, like how old are my grandparents? Like, were they there for that? And, you start to think historically. That's the opportunity that we have. It's on us right now. We're doing the work. And I know that every one of you, just by virtue of you being here tonight, are part of the solution. So let's get out there and keep the revolution going. So that's me. Sorry, I promised to try to fill an hour and a half, but I wasn't able to fill it all. So
Now, we're a little bit past our allocated time, so anyone who would like to leave now can do so without any demerits. And so, but I think that it was so engrossing, I didn't want to give you the hook because it was such a powerful talk. So might I suggest that you could stay and take a few questions for the people who would like to stay?
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a microphone. If you just Have time for a couple of questions. If you raise your hand, I will run it to you.
Stun them into silence. I love it.
So how did you feel, how do you feel about the Ken Burns, Jeffrey Ward American Revolution?
I was so excited when in early 2019, when Ken came to the Museum of the American Revolution, I got to give him a tour of the exhibition, and he was talking about, he actually was at the museum in 2017 and kind of whispered, we're doing they were promoting the Vietnam series that he did, but he kind of whispered that we're doing the revolution next. So we knew, because those of you who remember 1990, the Civil War, there was the Ken Burns effect. There was this huge burst of public excitement and visitation to those sites. So we knew this was going to be great for us. We wish it had come sooner. It was like painful waiting for it to come. And I remember taking Ken through the galleries, and I wanted to look at his face as we turned the corner, and there was that wall of photographs, because he didn't realize that there were actually the faces of people who were alive during that era, and it was awesome. So I think we immediately saw, after it aired in November, immediately saw people showing up at the museum who were telling our educators, like, oh yeah, I saw the series, and I realized I don't really know very much about this story. So it's been good for business for sure. And the timing is great, obviously, with the 250th. So it's been a huge boon for us. Yes, well, you have to wait, sir.
Sorry,
Because we have to get you a microphone.
I'll give you an impossible task. If I have 2 days in Philadelphia, obviously one of them is going to be at the museum. What should I be doing for that other day, especially this year?
Do you really love history?
If I can convince my wife to do it, I'll do it.
You'll probably spend 2 days at the Museum of the American Revolution. No, I will tell you maybe the 4 or 5 block area around us, I have started calling the campus of the University of America, because this is, with Independence Park, we're at the east end of if you think of it as like an L, we're here, Independence Hall is here, National Constitution Center, Liberty Bell, the Weitzman Museum of American Jewish History, you got Christ Church, you got all the historic congregations along Pine Street. If you're like me, I love graveyards. We got some great graveyards in Philadelphia. So you will have literally no problem. I'm not just being selfish. I really actually think starting with the Museum of the American Revolution, even before you go to Independence Hall, you'll have deeper, richer context for what all those places are. And then don't overlook some of the Powell House that I mentioned, which is literally a 30-second walk down 3rd Street. There's a lot of these, smaller institutions out in Germantown, if you can kind of afford a little couple-hour excursion. There's a series of really significant homes. Cliveden was actually a house that was turned into a fort during the Battle of Germantown. I mean, this amazing story. Stenton, which is the home of James Logan, who was the secretary for William Penn, and then settled and built this incredible country home in Germantown. But 75%, I hope they're not watching and are going to yell at me because but it's a huge portion of the furnishings are actually all from the family. So it's not just things like the things that were here, but they're literally the things that were there. It's Philadelphia is just so rich with hidden gems like that. Yeah, so look forward to seeing you there. Yes, sir.
So there are many reasons for preserving and continuing to remember history. There are pragmatic reasons so we don't repeat it. There are psychological reasons. There are also reasons of how it provides identity to a people. But as a steward of this, I would say a glorious tradition. What is your personal view of this, and why you do this, and what is it that you want to make sure gets transmitted with all this effort?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, because when you were talking about what your mission in life is, and this sort of thinking holistically about society, rather than compartmentalizing, sort of health and then the environment and that, particularly because of the pandemic, I think we thought a lot about science, right? And STEM and health, et cetera. But does anybody disagree that the civic health of the nation is like worthy of a little reinforcement right now? And I really see there are a lot of very good people working on trying to bring more civic education and, you know, lots of institutions. What we're trying to, the way we're trying to situate ourselves is that it's sort of a critique, but not a critique. But I will say a lot of those efforts, I think, don't go deep enough to start. Almost every one of those institutions will say, Thomas Jefferson says that a society that wants to be ignorant and free wants what never was and never will be. So you need to know all this stuff, right? Which sounds to most people like eat your vegetables, they're good for you. And I managed to raise 2 children. My son is 6'6". My daughter is 6 feet tall. They learned to eat their vegetables, but not because they liked them. It's because we started watching, this is a true story for any young families tuning in here. We started watching cooking shows like Chopped, right? The Great American Baking Show. And they started, like they got curious about, oh, I wonder, they're describing these flavors. I want to try to, and these were kids who only ate like white colored food, like yogurt, white bread. They wouldn't even eat yellow American cheese. They were that bad. And now they're just like cooking and it's because it's about stories, I think. And so what I think we do really well, and what I'm trying to sort of start a movement is, I'm describing us as the prebiotic for the civic health of the nation. You know, you have to start by sparking the kind of curiosity, right? And not just in young people, all of us could use a little spark of curiosity. And when you start sort of following a story of people and you realize, oh yeah, you're caught up in the problems that they're having, people in predicaments, which is really the way we decided what would be in the museum, because you can't tell all the stories. So it really is a museum of people in predicaments, figuring it out. And then you realize that the system of government that we want you to learn about, that's the vegetables part, right? Like, is the result of real people trying to figure out, you know, this would be a lot better if we could use the pen rather than the sword to work out our differences. But if you just tell people it's important, most people are going to tune out. So I think we are so inhabiting exactly the space that you're talking about. Your remarks actually just landed so much in my heart, because that's what we're trying to do. You know, it's all part of a whole, for sure.
Thank you for doing what.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you. Got one over here.
Time for one more? All righty.
If you shout it out, I'll repeat it. How's that for our online audience? Yep. Apparently, I'm gifted at telling stories for the online audience.
And to utilize the facts to tell those stories. I'm curious, among the things Washington had to do was convince the troops, but he also had to convince the country to sort of stay on board. And I love the tent analogy, and he's in there with, you know, the common man and fighting. What impact did that have on the country? Was that part of the message? And if not, how did he sell it to I know it's an entire different lecture, but I'm curious, as it applied to the country, did they also see this as his commitment?
Yeah, so 2 points I'd make. One is to remember that because you know, a very large portion of the male population of the colonies spent some time in military service. You know, it was a very small group who were the long-term, you know, those Continental Army soldiers that were in the field for 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But if you count militia service and that sort of thing, so I like to think about, you know, Washington as the thesis advisor, right, for those students. I mean, he's teaching them what this Republican revolution is, you know, what it's going to be to live in a republic. And they play a role in educating society, you know, around them as well. So I think it's important. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yep. Oh, one, can we spare one more?
Well, sure,
Why not?
You're the boss. One
Where do
more,
we
you're
have
good.
to be? It's cold out and, yep. Oh,
Excuse me, who made up the military at this point?
mm-hmm.
Of course, there's obviously no draft. So.
Well, so there were, yeah, so
how
actually
does it
in,
expand?
in the middle years of the war, there was actually there were some states that did institute a draft. There are a couple of phases. In 1775, there was actually a writer referred to the rage militaire, the rage for military things. So you tended to see a very broad section of society from, wealthier individuals, middle class, et cetera, who are all turning out in defense of their liberties. It's a long British tradition, of course, which always had looked down on and been concerned about professional armies. That was something the French did. That was something about absolutist monarchs. Britain, in its tradition, always relied on the Navy. They wanted a small army. They had, remember Cromwell, right? You don't want a professional army. You don't want men who are detached from their communities, because being rooted in your families and your communities makes you sort of safe, right? That you're they're like mini Cincinnatuses. So early, probably 1775, that's the case. By the end of 1776, that low moment there when the army had shrunk down to like 3,000 men. I mean, they were really like the saving remnant of Washington's army. Washington pleads with Congress. He says, the problem is the first 2 years of the war, they would enlist the army, but then their enlistments would expire at the end of the year. So that happens in 1775. It happens in 1776. So actually to have an army to cross the Delaware for the Second Battle of Trenton, he has to beg everybody, I will pay you can you just stick with us for a couple more weeks, right? He realizes we are not going to be able to win this if we have to keep reinventing the army every year, because those are new soldiers. It takes about a year to actually master the skills that you need to be an effective combat infantryman in this era. So in 1777, Congress says you can enlist people for 3 years or an open-ended or for the war. And they begin enlisting an army for those longer periods of enlistment. As that happens, you start to see men who have, more means in society, not signing up, right? They've got more to lose, right? You're a prosperous mill owner or whatever, your business, your livelihood is gone. So the socioeconomic status of the men starts to drop. You start to see more men of color, for instance, not just men of African descent, American Indian veterans, particularly in New England. You had a lot of Native people who were living surrounded on reservations, surrounded by white settlers in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, who were also serving in the Continental Army. So the social status of those men starts to drop through the later years of the war. By the time of Yorktown, there's probably conservatively, at least 8,000 men of African descent who are have served in the Continental Army at that point. So it depends on like when you're talking in the war, but generally speaking, the status of those men is going to be lower and lower as the war goes on.
Thank you all
Yep.
very much. I think that's going
Yeah.
to wrap for us. but
Yeah, happy to come up.
Thank you all for coming this evening, and we thank Scott for his
Thank you.
amazing presentation. It feels
Thank you.